Okay, can everybody online hear me? Perfect. So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being here in person and on Zoom. I'm very happy to have Sam Allison back with us, who will be doing another presentation on militarism, capitalism, and feminism. He also has two people online who are going to join the conversation. Ewan Booth and his wife, Kathleen McKen, are online and will be also participating in the presentation. So thank you very much, Sam, for coming again, and I'll leave it up to you.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming here today, and those on Zoom, thank you for watching. I'm in a place called Moran Heights. I live in Gore, but we're about an hour and a half drive from Montreal, and people here are listening in. Well, as you can see from the screen, oops. Sorry, well, we're going to talk about militarism. We're going ahead here. We're going to talk about militarism, capitalism, and feminism. That seems an unusual combination for people, but in fact, as you'll see in the course of the talk, that these two things, or these three things, are actually quite related. Okay, and start off by saying here, whash went the broadsword. Well, that symbolizes the Fraser Highlanders because they became famous for a sword charge of all things, and it was the last sword charge in British history. But I'll explain in a few minutes why it was so highly effective. But that symbolized them, and they were the last to use the sword, but their methods were copied much later for other things. Well, I'm going to talk about who these soldiers were. Where did they come from? How were they perceived at the time? They were perceived at different times in history, and their sort of identity keeps changing over the years as people discover new things about them. Talk about myths and reality. There's a great many historical myths have grown about these people, but the reality is really quite different. Okay, so I'll be covering a good deal of ground here, but mainly why they were so famous at the time and why they were so successful as a military unit. They were incredibly successful. They were lauded by people literally all over the world for what they did. Well, there were three broad groups of Highlanders in the 78th Fraser Highlanders when they raised the regiment, 1757. First, there were the Jacobites. They're the people who fought for King James. Jacob is the Latin for James. They were called Jacobites. He was a Catholic, but the rest of Britain didn't like that. So at the Battle of Culloden, the Jacobites were defeated. That's a picture of it's a rather romantic picture. They weren't really like that. They didn't all have kilts and tartans and so on, but it's a picture of them. But the second group, surprisingly, there were a lot of Hanoverians. That's the redcoats who had fought against the Jacobites at Culloden. So they had two groups in there. One had fought for the king, the present king, King George, and one had fought against him. But the third group, the most interesting, the most ignored, were the officers from European armies. Now, the Scots had been mercenaries for several hundred years. The most famous was down here, the French army. There were a great many Scots in the French army. So they left the French army, joined the British army to fight the French. These people were legitimate mercenaries. What happened was they get free commissions. If you fought for the king, you got a free commission. So they sell up their commissions in France and get a free commission in Britain. And if they live, when they retire, they get a pension. Okay, but not just from France. There were Scots mercenaries from Holland. The Dutch had 3 or 4 Scots regiments. There may have been some from Poland. You can't really tell because they're the same names. And these guys would sometimes change their names because they were wanted as Jacobites in Britain to join the Polish army, get a different name, and then join the British army. So you have a big problem about who they were. But the main point is there were 3 broad groups, and the mercenaries were, were very important because they knew a good deal about the French army. Now, the recruitment of the actual soldiers took place all over Scotland. Now, this Dundee here, it's a Highland regiment. Dundee is in the south of Scotland, in the lowlands. But that's the time of the agricultural revolution. Lots of Highlanders worked in the lowlands, rather like here today. Lots of Mexicans, West Indians work in our farms. The Highlanders used to go down to the lowland farms to work. This is the time of the agricultural revolution in Scotland. It was the Industrial Revolution is more famous, but the Agricultural Revolution was incredibly important. They pioneered it. They were the first to do all sorts of things. They used statistics to measure growing patterns. So the Highlanders had worked in the lowlands, and they were recruited in the lowlands, but they were recruited from all over the place there. You see, I managed to track them down in a great many different places. This is Bewley here, where the chief of the Clan Fraser lived. He was a politician later in life, and he said, oh, I raised the regiment from my clan. He didn't. He's a politician, and surprised, he told lies at times. But they were recruited from all over the country, and only a minority came from the Clan Fraser. 200, maybe 300. There were 1,200 men enlisted. Now, you think, so what? The point is, though, they were raised from all over Scotland, and when they returned from Canada, they brought home news about Canada. They brought home news about Canada to the rest of Scotland. So the Scots in the Highlands, the Lowlands, even in the tiny islands, they knew about Canada as a land of opportunity and so on. So there was enormous interest in Canada when these men returned home. Now, the other thing about the regiment, officers and sergeants came from other Scots regiments. Okay, there were the people from the French army, the Dutch army. There were people from the other British regiments. So they were incredibly professional. But sadly, the Canadian historians, regard them as a war party of the Clan Fraser. That's totally ludicrous. These guys were highly professional. They knew what they were doing. They knew how to control the men and so on. And they knew a great deal about the French army. Well, they were formed, they fought and disbanded in the 18th century. Now, try and keep this in mind. The 18th century is very different to the 19th century, very different today. Yet the stereotype through the writings in the 19th century of Sir Walter Scott, he wrote books like Rob Roy. He romanticized the Highlands. He's the guy that said, glam, these are glamorous. He invented the word glamorous. Glam in Scots Gaelic means enchanted by fairies. So he said the Highlands were an enchanted place. It was a wonderful place. Total lies. They were seasoned international professional soldiers. They weren't all clansmen from the Clan Fraser. But he said to her, and the other thing is they're stereotyped in American revolutionary perspectives. And to a man, I traced a lot of them. None of them fought for the Americans in the Revolution, not one. And you'll see why in a few minutes. But the big myth is that they fought out of loyalty to King George during the American Revolution. They didn't. The real reason was they got 50 acres after the 7 Years' War. Then when the revolution broke out, King George said, fight the Americans, I'll give you 200 acres. So to a man, they joined to fight the Americans. I didn't trace one soldier from the Frasers, and there were hundreds who fought for the Americans. Okay, the reality, well, they had fame and success in the 18th century, but I want you to keep this in mind. They're products of the Scots mercenary migratory tradition. Remember, these soldiers had migrated to France, to Poland. There were thousands of Scots in Poland, and the Scottish Enlightenment in the 18th century. This is very important. But this is the time where John Knox, a famous Calvinist, he said, right, every child has to read the Bible to reach God. Men and women have to be literate. And in the 18th century, Scotland was probably the only country in the world where the vast majority of people were literate. Women as well. Women had to read the Bible. And you'll see why this is important in a few minutes. Well, they're famous for the battle on the Plains of Abraham, September the 13th, 1759. This was a world war, the 7 Years' War, between France and Britain, and they had different allies at different times, but the main fight was between France and Britain. Now, General Wolfe was assigned to capture the fortress of Quebec. 78th were just one of his regiments trying to capture the fortress of Quebec. That was his aim. It wasn't to conquer all of New France. It was to get the fortress of Quebec, because the Quebec fortress guards the St. Lawrence River. Once you capture that fortress, the French in France couldn't get into New France. This is Wolfe's aim. And the sword charge, we'll talk about that in a minute. This is from a French soldier. He said, I'll never forget the Fraser Highlanders flying wildly after them, meaning his friends, with streaming plaids, bonnets, and large swords, like so many infuriated demons. And that became a global thing. And the American historian made a great point. He said, the Frasers didn't just charge the French army, they charged into global history. And you'll see in a minute why that is. But I think that's a good way to describe it. Now, here's Quebec City. This is what they were trying to capture. You see the waves, the river is actually flowing from left to right, but it's tidal. It's a very tidal place. At the top over here is the fortress. This is the lower town, that's the upper town. This is the St. Charles River. Okay, you'll see that in a few minutes in the map. That's what they had to capture. So Wolfe to do two things, to defeat nature, to cross that river, climb the cliffs, and fight the French. There were three things he had to do. Well, this is a map showing you what happened. There's Quebec City over there. Wolfe came from here. This is camp up there. I can't get this thing right. And he attacked from here, trying to get to the lower town. But the attack failed because he had sloops, big ships, trying to land here. But the ships were too big and it stuck in the sand. The ships couldn't unload, so he was badly defeated. His first attempt, badly defeated. And so he changed his tactics. What he did, he used one of the, he had 30 of these. These are landing craft. They were flat bottom and they could go very close to the shore. They had a waterproof ramp at the front. They could disembark very fast. And the soldiers had practiced this again and again while they're besieging Quebec. They went in and out of these boats. They could go in and out very fast. But these boats could carry soldiers right up to the shore. So it took Wolfe only 8.5 hours to load the landing craft, travel downstream, disembark in silence, and he scaled the cliffs. We'll see how that in a minute. And he was on the high ground. It's a fantastic feat. Even today, if you could do that distance and do it fast, it would be a remarkable feat. Now here's Wolfe's Cove. It's shallow and sheltered from the tide. This is where they landed. You can see there, it's a nice little bay. And that's where they landed. The tide's going from right to left. And it meant that the soldiers could disembark safely. The boats were emptied, floated, then they can get more people. Now, here's the thing that most historians have missed. The sentries are at the top of the cliff. They were not drunk. They were not inattentive, but they couldn't see down to the bottom. I've been there. When you look down, you can't see the little cove. And you can't hear it either. The tide's going. I've been there when the tide's going out. It makes a big roar. So the sentries, in the history books, it says, oh, the sentries were drunk. They were asleep. They weren't. They just couldn't see or hear. This is a picture. This may be an inaccurate picture. It was found about 2 years ago, discovered in Britain. And it gets the idea that they're going up the cliff, the path up the cliff. It wasn't as straight as that. But here's the interest. You can see the little rowboats, the landing craft here. These are sloops. They had 2 guns. They took them up the cliff as well. Incredible feat. But what they did, they landed here. And there was Captain McDonald. We'll talk about him in a minute. He landed way over here somewhere. He was in the lead boat with Wolfe, 10 Highlanders. And he's the guy in the dark. They climbed up the cliff. An incredible feat. I don't know if you've seen the cliffs, but they're very formidable. I suspect what he did in the Highlands of Scotland, a lot of these islanders lived on the islands and used to climb the cliffs to steal birds' nests. They were expert climbers. So he went up there in rapid time, went back along the top of the cliff there. The sentries were on guard. He had been in the French army. This guy was fluently by it. He said, stand down, and he shot them. So he chased them away, and then Wolfe's army came up the cliff in record time. Show you a map of what happened. Here's the city here. There's where they attacked at first. And on the September the 12th in the evening, Captain Cook, the famous explorer, led a diversionary attack down here where the British attacked the first time. They fired guns. They had rowboats filled with sailors pretending to land. And this here worked because the French here thought this is where the attack was going to be. But in reality, Wolfe was up here with the army. He'd come up in the night over several days, and they sailed down. There's here is Bougainville. The French had to send some of the men upriver because the British were stopping supplies coming to Quebec City. Quebec City was starving. The Brits besieging were better fed than the people in Quebec City because they couldn't get supplies. There were no roads in Quebec, couldn't use the river except at night. And so they were expecting supply ships, but they weren't. They got wolf instead. But this guy, Bougainville, had many soldiers with him. He didn't even know the Brits had landed. The man in here, he thought it was a diversion. And Vaudreuil thought it was a diversion. They were completely taken in by this false attack. So they sailed down the river. The sentries were alert. Here it was a Captain Simon Fraser. It wasn't the colonel. Another Simon Fraser. He'd been in the French army. The Dutch army, but he spoke French. He shouts to the sentries, "Shut up! We're supply boats bringing supplies for the city. Be quiet." So he went past. The sentries were alert. Then the second guy, I told you already, Captain MacDonald, climbs the cliffs, goes back and kills the sentries, knocks in. So they get up the cliffs, okay, in rapid time. And here's why the battle was decisive and how this is a 3D map. It's called the Plains of Abraham. That's very misleading. It's undulating. It's not, if you've ever been there, it's not plains. It's undulating. It's very difficult terrain. But this area here, where the battle was fought, had been farmed. It was all flat. It was nice, not flat, but it was sloping, but it was all cleared. There were cornfields there were no trees, no rocks, and so on. And the Frasers, the regiment, oh, sorry, how do I go back? Sorry. I touched something wrong. Yeah, so, okay, thank you. Sorry. If you look at the map then, Plains is a misnomer. The Frasers were second here in line at the top of the cliff. The Brits had arrived in the middle of the night and they lay down to sleep. They slept. But the French army had been up all night and they were forced marched. They had to go up several miles and they came here. Now, they did not line up. That's a it's very difficult to say, to put them in there because most of them were farm boys. There were 3 or 4 trained French regiments. The rest were just farm boys drafted into the army. They had never marched. They had muskets, no bayonets, hunting guns. They were, they weren't proper soldiers. Montcalm's aide-de-camp was a Jacobite Scot, and he was furious. He writes Montcalm's orders, but the officers in among the French army couldn't read. They were not literate, and they couldn't tell them what to do. So the men were very disorganized. But the Brits were all lined up. They'd slept for a couple of hours. They were fresh. They're on top of this. It's called the Heights of Abraham. Very steep. They're there. You see the land. They charge them, but it's a disorganized charge. They fire volleys into the French, and this is where the sword charge really counts. The French, no French soldier reached the British line. They couldn't get up the slope, but the Frasers charged down the slope with the swords here. The French were tired, couldn't run away, so they killed several hundred of them with the swords. And this got written up in the British newspapers. The French recognized it. Everybody recognized. That's why the sword charge was effective. Not because they were that great with the swords. The soldiers that were fighting were just tired, couldn't run away, and they chased them all the way down the cliff here. Some of the Frasers were killed down here. Captain McNeill of Barra, he was killed. But the nurses in the General Hospital said it was terrible. We listened to our ancestors, our relatives being massacred by the Highlanders. These guys were ruthless. Nobody really knows how many French died, but the British buried 1,000 to 1,200. But I'm afraid modern Quebec historians say, oh, it was a draw. You see, it wasn't anything like a draw. But as this Prime Minister Pitt heard about this, he said, oh, I called them forth. I'm the guy. The Prime Minister took over and he said, I'm the man that recruited the Highlanders. So they had become socially accepted in England because of this charge. And the thing is, they captured the city. They took the city. That was Wolfe's objective. The French army escaped. They went down to Montreal. They came back again. They didn't recapture it. But people forget, Wolfe wasn't trying to defeat all the French. He was just trying to capture the city. Now, what happened was, this is New France, there's Canada there in blue. People didn't live there. There weren't many French people living there, but it's the biggest land transfer in history when that was signed over to the Brits. And one of the interesting things is, it was a Lieutenant Alexander Fraser gets in a canoe. He wears wampum. It's very interesting. He gets wampum from the Iroquois. He goes down the river, and the native people respect the wampum. They respect the fact that he's got this. But the French soldiers and the French traders didn't like it. They tried to kill him. But I think it's very interesting that the natives respected the peace. Peace had been declared in 1763. The French soldiers down the river there didn't know. They didn't hear anything. But they knew that there probably was a peace. And this chap, Fraser, said to them, look, you can kill me if you like, but the British will hang you at the other end if you get nowhere, or the French will even hang you. So he does a remarkable journey, and he becomes very much a sort of protege of the native people. And in the American Revolution, the British marksmen, they were called, they hunt the American Rangers. That's something the American historians don't talk about. They were hated by the Americans because they outfought them. Now, here's what happened. They patrolled, the regiment was given the task of patrolling and living in Quebec. Okay, this is not the Frasers. I couldn't get an 18th century picture. This is an early 19th century picture. You mustn't think of them living in forts. These soldiers are spread out, and they canoed, they snowshoed, they adapted to conditions. Okay, one of the myths is the British Army just stood there in forts. That didn't happen to them. It's only one regiment chosen to occupy New France. They went down to PEI, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. Oh, they were only in small numbers. New York, Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, they were all over the place. So they couldn't be controlled. But what they did, the Klansmen adapted the condition and they became frontiersmen. The boatsmen, they double dipped. They made a lot of money working on the side. They were still paid in the army, but they made good money doing different work. The most famous was Sergeant Ross. He was in charge of the river pilots. He was on the boats to translate for the British soldiers and boats coming in. He translates, and then he says, I'll be a pilot. He's still being paid by the army, but he gets money as a pilot. He goes down the river, and they also set up, you'll hear about this in a minute, they set up whiskey distilleries all the way down the river, and they sold whiskey to the boats coming in. So they made an awful lot of money, and General Murray runs out of cash, and he gets a real shock because he borrows about £3,000 or £4,000 from the regular soldiers. And he's astounded that these guys, these were capitalists, they were double dipping, but they were working as boatsmen, frontiersmen, woodsmen, any job at all, and they changed. They were no longer just Klansmen. They were, they were adapting to life here. Talk about feminism in the 78. There was great intermarriage. We'll talk about that in a minute. Family migration, wives and children came over, talk about that. Migration of women's groups from Scotland. Women formed their own groups and emigrated to Canada. There's a statistical survey. I'll show you the stats on this. It's not just me making it up. And show you a couple of voices. Highland women wrote books about it. So this is where the feminist side comes in. Well, one last little thing. Women win the vote, 1791 in Lower Canada. That was a man called Richardson, Highland Scot. They lose the vote later on. It's something that Canadian feminists don't talk about. I don't know why, but women had the vote. If you own property, an eldest daughter could vote if she owned a farm or a lot of them owned pubs, spirit ale houses, and they could vote, and they did vote. But it's taken away from them, and I don't know why, but I think Canadian history is very. Anyway, this is the most famous painting it's a 19th century painting, but you get the idea, the jealous husband. This thing sold thousands. They all thought it was a big joke, but you see what's happening. The Highland soldiers, sort of going with other people's wives. They were stationed from 1760, and the legal records, I couldn't figure this out. I looked at the legal records. It showed financial payments to French Canadian women, and these said they would give £200 to a Genevieve Fraser or Annette. why are they giving money to these? But then I realized it was babies. They had got women pregnant, and they had to give them money. They weren't allowed to marry. See, if you were in the British Army, you couldn't marry the enemy till after the war. They weren't allowed to marry them. I'm afraid they didn't pay too much attention to the rules, and a surprising number had illegitimate children. Then there was post-war intermarriage on a large scale with the French Canadians. I'm going to talk about that in a bit more detail later, and with the Yankees. Remember, the officers especially, they owned big bits of land, and they were a prize catch to American women on the frontier and in New York and all that. The officers in the British Army, a bit like they see these TV plays, they wanted to intermarry with a wealthy Brit. Now, there was 180 soldiers discharged in Quebec, and they claimed land in upstate New York and Vermont. You see it there. Remember, Vermont was not one of the 13 colonies. Neither was upstate. It was part of New France. So they were given land in the former New France, Vermont. And the American historians forget that. Now, I was doing this study. I went to, had to go to Albany because New Hampshire didn't exist and all the records are in New York State. And I used to look at this, and I found the names of soldiers discharged in Scotland. It's very clear these guys went back to Scotland, and then they're claiming land alongside soldiers who were discharged in Quebec. Yeah, but there must be a mistake, but I kept finding these people, 2 or 3 discharged in Quebec, 2 or 3 discharged in Scotland. And I thought, there must be a big mistake here, because these guys have gone to Scotland, these guys stayed here. They're all mixed up. And then I realized what happened was the discharged soldiers in Scotland returned to North America with their own families and the families of those who had been charged in North. They had an arrangement going. 2 or 3 said, we'll find good land. 2 or 3 said, we'll go back to Scotland and we'll bring out the wives and children. Okay, so the whole point about this emigration was it was family migration. Okay, this is a family migration. Most people just say it's a military migration. It wasn't. Families were going. Now, this is the landing of the Hector, 1773. That's one of the most famous paintings in Canadian history, but it's a bit romantic, I'm afraid. It's a great society. If you want to find out about Scots immigration, the Hector Society is excellent, excellent. They departed from the Fraser estate in Scotland. They picked up various groups, then they came to Canada. But this is a romanticized painting. It's what I call the Sir Walter Scott view of the Scots. You know, they're all wearing kilts. And the fact is, they'd been in sea for 3 or 4 weeks. They had got all different diseases. A lot of them died. They didn't look like that when they came off the boat. And they certainly weren't allowed to wear broadswords, pipes, or kilts. They were banned at the time in Scotland. But what is correct is that the presence of family groups. Okay, now this is the romantic picture that we get of Scots migration to Canada, but the reality is very different. Here it is. Here's the reality: a harsh, tough existence. The woman is the center of the picture. The man hunts, cuts the trees. The woman grows potatoes. They live miles from anywhere, and it must have been a dreadfully tough life for women especially, because later on the men work in timber camps. They get out of the place, but the women are there. So women are central to understanding this, and they were a hard lot. When I talk about this, I'm not romanticizing the Highlanders in any way. These were tough people. You didn't cross them in military things, but you needed that to settle. Most of the French had settled down the rivers, but these guys went inland. That's part of it. They could go inland a long way. They got their land cleared, but the woman was central to Scottish migration. Okay. Give you a story of a couple of these guys. This man, Alan Stewart, 78, he recruits migrants for North Carolina and Glen Appin. He gets different groups. He wants to go to North Carolina. He's got relatives there. He gets to North Carolina, revolution breaks out. So he raises a regiment of North Carolina Highlanders in the American Revolution to fight the Americans. And here's where it gets, I think, interesting. He becomes the colonel of an African-American regiment. He leads black soldiers in the American Revolution, something American historians do not want to talk. I went to Georgia trying to trace these guys, and even the black groups said, oh no, we were for the revolution. I said, no, you weren't. You had regiments fighting for the Brits. Oh no. So he raises this regiment, and he claims land in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and he gets land. I only managed to trace one soldier because of the names and the see, it's now Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. Then it was one place. It's very hard to trace. I only managed to trace one guy, but it's a big myth that they abandoned the soldiers here. I'm not saying they were good. I'm sure the black people were not treated that well, but it's a myth that they didn't get land. Okay. He dies in Scotland, recruiting settlers. He gets landed in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. It's very hard to trace the guy because these are two separate provinces now, and that's why it's difficult. Now here's the sort of groups. He's Alan Stewart, lieutenant in the Frasers. This is a British survey. The Brits were surveying those who left. Lily Stewart, his illegitimate daughter, but he's got a servant. Okay. Then there's Kenneth Stewart. He was also an officer in the Frasers. He's a shipmaster. Look at his wife. Here's the interesting thing. Son is 14. The other children are much younger. That indicates he was in the army in Canada when the younger ones were born. But look, he's got 3 servants. I've used the original spelling here. It's Carmichael, and he's got the servants over here as well. These were not poor people. But here's I think, the really interesting thing. This is a women's group who are emigrating. They raised their money. They may have had money from Canada. They probably did, but they're spinsters. That doesn't mean, 18th century meaning they spun flax and wool. They came to North America and they worked. So these were all spinsters. They're probably relatives. As I said, I couldn't trace them. They're in North Carolina. I suspect they had 1 or 2 soldiers there to meet them. But they formed a little group, they raised the money, they pay the money, and they get going to Canada. So women were emigrating in their own right. And I think this is an important part. I'm going to look at statistics now, just to back up what I'm saying. This man, Bernard Bailyn, he won the Pulitzer Prize for this, and he found, this is 18th century, the Scots different from every other migrants to North America. He surveyed people going to Canada, the United States, everybody. And the Scots were different from everybody. They wrote letters back, and he couldn't figure out why they wrote so many letters, but they did. They wrote more letters than anybody else. What I think it was, the husbands writing to the wives and the wives writing back, linking up with each other. But he analyzed them in terms of male and female, children, young men, family groups, immigrants by ship. And this is going to be a big surprise to most of you, indentured to Americans. You probably know what that means. To get to the States or get to North America, you could get your passage paid, but you have to work for somebody for 7 or 8 years or whatever to pay back the money. But you see what happens when you compare the Scots and the English. Here's the English. 84% of the English were male, 60% of the Scots were male. 40% of the Scots were female. As I said, there were more Scots women than any other national group coming to North America at that time. Children, very interesting. 40% of the Scots were children. They were coming as families. That meant they lived longer in North America. It meant they retained their identity. Young men, only 20% of the Scots were young men. 66% of the English were young men. Family groups, 20%. Nearly half the Scots came as a family unit. They could bring over the children. The Scots, and people say, oh, the Highlanders were poor. But how on earth did they manage to bring over their wives and children if they were so poor in Scotland? Here's immigrants per ship, 15 per ship. The Scots came in groups and they'd rent a ship. 3 or 4 groups would say, we're going, and the ship would go to 3 or 4 places and pick them up. The other interesting thing, ships carrying 150 more people, only 7% of the English, 66% of the Scots came in ships. The reason there were so many ships going to Scotland was the tobacco trade. Glasgow was the centre of tobacco. Ships would come to Glasgow. The ships had nothing to take back except people. So it was cheaper, and these ships would take big groups. They go to 3 or 4 places, pick up the people, and off they go. And I think the last one is really incredible. Only 18% of the Scots were indentured. Baron makes this point, they're the lowest indenture rate of any national group. 68% of the English were indentured. That meant for much of their working life, they had to work for somebody else. Because the Scots were so few, and when they got, young men got there, young people got, they worked for themselves. Okay, they weren't working for someone else. And I think this is a very important aspect. Moving on, women had a voice then. This is Anne Grant, daughter of a Highlands. She's the cousin of the Alan Stewart fellow told a few minutes ago. She writes the best story of life before the revolution in North America, and the Americans recognize that. She writes, it's a one, I've got the book, it's a wonderful book. That's her. She goes back to Scotland later, but she writes about them being friendly with the native people, how the officers got land in all different places. They got good land, and that's why they were hated by the Yankees, because they were there first and they had the choice. So women had a voice then that perhaps they don't. So the impact of North America, this is the Enlightenment time. The agricultural revolution was really important. Potato, General Murray paid for farmers to find the best potatoes suited for Canada. He paid for that. And that's the first time in history a government has subsidized agricultural research. Okay, and he finds the best spud for Canada, and they use that. Apples, the Macintosh apple. Macintosh was the son of one of the, probably a Fraser, two guys with the same name. But anyway, Macintosh apple, he grafted the apples. He knew how to graft them. And that's why the Macintosh apple is the biggest apple in the world, because these guys were very much in line with the agricultural revolution. Steel plows. John Deere claimed to invent the steel plow in about 1835, 1836 in America. The Scots were running around with steel plows here in the 1790s. They imported them from Scotland. Okay. Timber and fur was expanded. Banking, the soldiers had to be paid. So the loyalists had to be compensated. Remember, this is the time of Adam Smith and capitalism and so on. So the Scots were imbued with capitalism, with money. They knew about banking. The French army didn't get paid like that. The fact when they got here, they had all promissory notes and so on. There was no money in New France. Medical advance, the Scots, a man called Maitland brings back from the Middle East inoculation. They inoculated the soldiers. Okay, and the Highlands, it was the inoculated people. There's no choice. You're going to be inoculated. It's going to save your life. Shut up. There's no nonsense about it. And what happened in the American Revolution, the Americans besieged Quebec City. Nearly half the American army died of smallpox. None of, called the Royal Highland Emigrants, none of them died of smallpox. They'd all been inoculated. That they were modern in the way the Americans were not. That's something I think we should realize, that we in Canada were modern in the way the Americans were, and they lost the chance to capture in Quebec because of smallpox. The Industrial Revolution, well, that comes later in Canada, by 1800, by 1812, we're building steamboats. And in the 1812 war, the first steamboat used in the war was the Swiftsure, built in Montreal. That's something we don't remember, but the Industrial Revolution came to Canada as well, but the steam came later than the Agricultural Revolution. Well, give you one example of these guys. John Nairn, that's him there. He's in the Scots Brigade, he's a mercenary, he fights for the Scots Brigade in Netherlands, gets a free commission, I'll join the British Army. He did. He's a captain in the 78th, he writes, he's at the siege of Louisbourg. He writes in his orderly book, you can find it, it's in the library on St. Helens Island. Marvelous book. He writes the book, and he says something that use the men kindly, but not with familiarity. You know, these are professional soldiers, and his advice is excellent. After he becomes a seigneur, a loyalist, he recruits French Canadians to fight, and he gets some of the land. In fact, Roman Catholics weren't supposed to be in the British Army, but 2 or 3 of them exhibited bravery, and Nairn got them officerships in the British Army. That's important. He encouraged French Canadians to fight against the Americans. Afterwards, he's a scientific farmer, this man. He is a member of the Agricultural Society of Canada. He helped start it. And he's the first guy who gets a steel plow. And he modernizes things in Canada. But he's a soldier and he's making money. In his seigneury, there was nobody living there. When he died, there was about 1,000 people there, mostly French Canadians. He did bring over Scots, but they wouldn't stay there because they wanted to own land. The seigneurs, remember, you rent, if you're a seigneur, you rented your land out, but the Scots didn't stay with him. But he had about 1,000 people living there. But here's the thing, at least 5 non-commissioned officers, 4 NCOs and 4 officers became seniors in Quebec, okay, Lower Canada. This is Sergeant, he's a sergeant, that's his house. It's still there in Quebec City. So this tells you something about how economically successful they were. And I think that upward economic mobility explains geographic mobility. You're not going to emigrate if you're going to be poorer. You're going to emigrate if you can make money, you're going to be richer. And this guy is was a sergeant. And it's still there, his house. That's a huge house even for today. So it tells you that if you were a soldier, you went up the social scale. Now, what is the Highland relationship? Sorry, when does Ewan come in? Sorry, we're going to have another chaps. Sorry, I'm going to get another chap to speak, but okay. So sorry, one more. What is the Highland relationship to North America? Well, most people think it's a push from the Highlands. They're pushed out, they're poor, they're forced out. And this is the usual thing, it's a symbol, the last of the clan, they're leaving. But in fact, I think they were pulled to North America. There's 3 things about immigration: a push, a passage, and a pull. Who pays the passage? If the Highlanders were so poor, how on earth did they manage to bring over their wives and children? So I think, as I said several times, the money comes from Canada. I think we're pulling them out. This is before 1815. After 1815, they have the clearances, but they drive them out. But this is the 18th century. So I think militarism pulled Highlanders socially and economically upwards across the Atlantic. So they pulled them out, and people knew they were going to be better off if they come to Canada. Okay. Land ownership, I think, was the key to it. Thanks. If you own land, well, you can vote, you can do all sorts of things with it. It's social security. So I think we should see them as enlightened victors of 1759 in the siege of Quebec. But I'm afraid historians see them as reactionary vanquished. They were defeated at Culloden. They were defeated at Yorktown in the American Revolution. They're seen as losers in history. And I think that's a big mistake. I think that's totally false. But just to reinforce what I've said, I'm going to go over to you, Ewan, now. Can you speak? This chap's going to tell us.
Can you hear us?
Yeah, can you hear?
Okay. I'm Ewan.
And I'm
Yes.
Kathleen.
And we have one example that will support what Sam is presenting. And we're going to leave us off the video for now. We'll go on to the video so you can see us during the question period. So the one case study is Donald McKinnon, who originally settled in St. Thomas, now the community of Montmagny in eastern Quebec. His building remains as the oldest structure within town limits, and that's the picture you're looking at right now.
We know he purchased the property in 1767. The building served as an inn and a merchant store in addition to his residence. The building returned to the McKinnon family in 2017, exactly 250 years later. Next slide.
Bing, next slide.
I don't think they changed the slides. Okay. Oh. blue screen. Okay, Donald McKinnon was born to Hugh McKinnon and Catherine MacDonald on the Isle of Eigg in the Inner Hebrides of Scotland. We know he had a brother, Lachlan, and two other brothers who fought at Culloden. He also had a sister, Christine McKinnon, who married Donald Henderson. History has since changed the family name to Anderson.
Okay, if you click a couple more times, you'll get the map of the inner, there we go. And then the next one, you'll get a picture of actually McPherson, but it's
Okay, good.
So he served as a corporal in the 78th Regiment of Foot from 1760 to 1763 and was garrisoned along with other soldiers of the regiment in the little communities along the St. Lawrence River. This is where he met Françoise Talon. Bing.
Two older brothers were killed. Okay.
So one more click, there we go. After the Frasers disbanded in 1763, he transferred to the 60th Regiment of Foot, also known as the Royal American Regiment, and he married his wife Françoise Talon in 1765 while garrisoned in Montreal at Notre Dame Basilica. And that's a copy of the actual document from the parish records.
Okay.
Bing.
So in 1766, Donald acquired a permit to be an innkeeper. Many other former Frasers also acquired permits, along with many women, including several widowed French Canadians.
I will let you click ahead there, please. So General Murray was the governor who issued these permits. He was another Scots soldier. General Murray is credited to be the architect who retained French language, the French civil code, and the Catholic religion in order to keep harmony and prosperity to the newly acquired British territory. Bing.
Okay.
During the war with Americans, Donald was commissioned as an officer with the 84th Regiment of Foot and fought against the rebel forces.
His wife ran the business and was empowered to make decisions in his absence. We have a notary document where she is selling 2 schooners to John McLeod, another former Fraser. She eventually joined him in Quebec City.
As a note, within the ranks of the Royal Highland immigrants are French and French Canadians. Them joining this locally raised Scottish regiment is a demonstration of the influence the Scots had on them as friends and neighbors. Bing.
In 1772, Donald sponsored his brother, Lachlan McKinnon, and his wife, Margaret MacDonald, and his sister, Christine McKinnon, and her husband, Donald Henderson, to travel to North America.
They traveled from the island of Eigg to Ile Saint-Jean, now the province of Prince Edward Island, and then from there to St. Thomas. They settled here, and ironically, both Lachlan and Donald Henderson became tavern keepers. This was a year prior to the arrival of the famed Hector. Bing. Donald eventually purchased the seigneury in Matane and moved there with his brother's family. He also sponsored other new residents to settle in the area. At the end of his life, he was a justice of the peace, an innkeeper, a merchant, and he represented the local area in the provincial legislative. He also owned a second residence in Quebec City.
He was able to read and write in both French and English and had taught his wife how to sign her name. His schooners would travel from Quebec City to Matane, trading and transporting goods for the other former Fraser Highlanders who were merchants and tavern keepers along the way. He had arrived in North America as a simple soldier, but had built a business with the help of his wife and other Scots and with French Canadians whom he had befriended.
We'll just get the slides to catch up. One reason why many Scots settled in the communities along the St. Lawrence River was familiarity. They were maritimers, and the scenery and archipelagos of islands remind them of home. Here they carved out a new life with their new families and friends to embed themselves into the Quebec culture we presently have. Many of the names have disappeared, but their bloodlines flow through many French-speaking Canadians today. Back to you, Sam.
Well, I'm saying that the Highland image in the old world was transformed by the success in the new world. And that really mattered in a way that we don't realize. And remember, in 1745, after the Battle of Culloden, the Highlanders were treated like savages, regarded as savages. I happened to be a Lowland Scot, and my lot joined in. It wasn't just the English, they joined in to treat them badly. Okay, they were regarded as savages in 1745. But 1759, they became soldiers to the British because of the Plains of Abraham. They were really successful. And they said, from the Prime Minister downwards, oh, these are wonderful soldiers. And the Scots in Scotland said, oh, the Highlanders are wonderful. So the image changed enormously. Then settlers pulled North American loyalists to what's now Canada, and they built a British empire. It was no longer the 13 English colonies. It was now a British empire, thanks to these Scots. So they changed the image of Britain abroad. England, it was no longer New England. It was a new Canada. It was a British Canada, if you like. They pulled the loyalists. But then something else happened. King George IV in Edinburgh, 1823, came to Edinburgh wearing a kilt of the Stuart tartan and various attributes of a Highland gentleman. And this brought great acclaim from everybody. And they became royal symbols. So by the time of Queen Victoria, she gets Balmoral, the royal family gave an established sort of recognition to these guys. So what happened was these people moved from savages to soldiers to settlers to symbols. And when we think about Scotland, we don't think about Adam Smith or various people from the Scottish Enlightenment. James Watt probably did more to change the world than anybody ever lived. But we don't think of them. We think of these guys wearing kilts and bagpipes. They became symbols, I think, because of what happened in Canada. And this is something that we should do. Now, I've written a book about this stuff. It comes from a song written by Robert Burns. Burns was part of the Scottish Enlightenment. Burns is the guy that wrote Auld Lang Syne and other famous books. Millions of people sing it every year. They've no idea who Burns was, but he did it. So it's not the Scottish Enlightenment that symbolizes Scotland. It's the Highland Scots. And it's a shame. He wrote a thing called Driven by Fortune's Fairy Spite. He wrote a song, and that's where I got the title of my book. I got the idea of Driven by Fortune. Now, I'll leave it to you. What is it? He's a very clever writer. What does he mean by fortune? It can mean bad fortune, misfortune, fate, or it can mean wealth and money. So I'll leave it to you to think about that. How did these people change? How did they become important? Was it just luck? They managed to defeat the French in the Plains of Abraham. They managed to defeat the Americans at Quebec City in the revolution. Was it just luck? Or was it wealth and money? Were they attracted to Canada? Did they come here because of the wealth, because of the money? I don't really know, but I'd like you to think about that. And, if you get any questions, I'll be quite happy. Anyway, thank you for listening. I'll be taking questions from anybody or everybody or nobody.
Thank you so much, Sam. I'm just going to stop the recording and then we'll do the Q&A, the question and answer period. One moment.